Before watching the video, please take 3 seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel to give me more motivation to make more quality videos. Thank you so much and wish you a happy new day. At the wedding venue, distinguished guests, to better understand today's female lead and the lifelong love of Miss Tong Van Con. Miss Tong Van Con, wearing a beautiful wedding dress and holding a bright red bouquet in her hand, had a sad, sarcastic look. What love, what lifelong love, is all just... She angrily pursed her lips. Next, please watch the VCR. In this grand ceremony, life is indeed full of irony. Even she is present here. How sarcastic. The guests below gasped in surprise, pointing at the screen above the stage. Everyone, look at the video, quickly. Tong Van Con turned around in shock. The whispering below kept buzzing. What's going on? Isn't that woman Tong Van Con's best friend? Yes, and she's even the bridesmaid standing on the stage. Wow, this woman's body is not bad. She's quite curvy. Tong Van Con looked at the big screen in astonishment. What is going on? Looking at the two figures on the screen, wrapped around each other without a shred of clothing, her cheeks burned. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Look at the man." The woman fearfully threw herself into the groom's arms. Seeing the two of them embracing each other on the stage, the whispers rose continuously. Isn't the man in the video the groom? Moreover, the two of them are standing right there on the stage. The people below fell into complete chaos. The groom angrily glared at Tong Van Con and shouted, "Van Con, what are you doing?" The bridesmaid, lying in the groom's arms, wept sorrowfully. Looking at her, she pretended to be heartbroken and said, "Van Con, didn't you agree not to pursue this matter anymore? I agreed with you that after the two of you get engaged, I would leave Tu Kiet and leave this city. Why? Why do you insist on making such a scene and ruining everything? Do you really want to force me to die?" Tears kept streaming down Tong Van Con's face as she covered her mouth in shock. Looking at her fake face, the groom looked at the bridesmaid in surprise and asked, "Tiu, what did you say? Van Con forced you to leave? Forced you to die?" He furiously glared at Tong Van Con and roared, "Tong Van Con, how can you be so vicious?" He slapped her. "You bitch. You even set up your best friend and fiancé. The good deed you did has completely disgraced both of our families." Tong Van Con, holding her hurt cheek, stood there frozen, looking at him in disbelief. Her tears rolled down her cheeks, her eyes filled with desolation and pain. Qiu smiled triumphantly at her. "Since you aren't saying anything, I might as well put on a bit more of a show." Acting on her thoughts, she stepped forward and shoved Tong Van Con hard. "Do you really have to force me to die before you let me go?" Tong Van Con, caught off guard, stumbled backward. Suddenly, a strong hand caught her waist. "Be careful." Tong Van Con collapsed to the ground, burying her face in her hands and sobbing. "Yes, I really." She raised her head, her face covered in tears, her eyes full of desolation and despair. In this situation, anyone would. Looking at the handsome face in front of her, Tong Van Con was stunned. She was like someone grabbing onto a straw to pull herself up. The man's lips parted slightly. Tong Van Con summoned all her courage, looked at him, and said, "Hello, sir. May I ask if you're currently single? My name is Tong Van Con, 22 years old, a student at M University. I own 40% of the shares in Tong's Media Entertainment. After I turn 25, I will inherit the entire estate left by my grandfather and mother. It's just that right now I have nothing. I need someone to marry. Would you agree to marry me?" The people below looked at her in disbelief and shock. Oh my God, has Tong Van Con gone mad? Listen to what she's saying. She just dragged a random man to marry her. A proposal like this should be done by a man. The man draped the veil over her and said gently, "My name is Mac Hai, then, 28 years old, single, currently working at RS International Group. Miss Tong Van Con, are you willing to marry me?" Tong Van Con looked at him with teary, moved eyes. The cake was wheeled in. Tong Van Con looked at him and whispered, "Thank you. I am willing to marry you. Thank heavens for sending me a man to rescue me at this moment. Who he is does not matter. What matters is that right now, at this very moment, he has saved me from this fire and water." Mac Hai then tightly held her hand. His suspended heart could finally rest easy. The guests below looked at Mac Hai then in astonishment. "What? Did I hear that right?" Mac Hai then. The Mac Hai Than of RS International. Dong Feng Con froze in shock. Oh my god, he is actually the legendary second young Master Mac. The whispers below rang in her ears. No way. Isn't young Master Mac known for keeping away from women? Could he be an imposter? Unfortunately, this man has never shown his face in public, nor has he accepted interviews. Even his photos have never been leaked, so we don't know if he's the real deal. I don't think he's fake. Even if you gave him 10 times the courage, would he dare to impersonate young Master Mac? Unless he doesn't want to live anymore. Besides, that man is indeed very handsome. Doesn't the legend say that young Master Mac is extremely handsome? Tong Van Con turned around, looked at the guests below, and announced, I will say this once more. The wedding between Tong Van Con and V2 Kiet is canceled. From now on, we will marry whoever we want and have nothing to do with each other. The guests below gasped in shock. How ridiculous. What kind of melodramatic drama is this? V2 Kiet puffed his cheeks in anger and snorted coldly. Chu looked at her in surprise. Really? Tong Van Con looked at everyone and continued, Tong Van Con, will marry Mac Hai then. Mac Hai then stood behind her, smiling gently at her. The entire hall fell silent. Tong Van Con nervously clutched her own arm. Mac Hai then stepped forward and tightly held her hand. Are you all Van Con's family? Today was very abrupt to announce our marriage in this way. On another day, Mac Hai then, will come to visit your home. The guests below gasped in awe. Tong Van Con looked at him in surprise. Is he really marrying me? A large, slender hand reached out in front of her. Mac Hai then took her hand and kissed it gently. Let's go. We have nothing left to do here. Suddenly, a pink-haired girl stood up, looked at Mac Hai then, and said, Mr. Mac, you cannot be with Tong Van Con. For the past few years, in order to get my brother, she used every trick to please him, annoying him to death. How could a woman my brother rejected be worthy of you? She glared at Tong Van Con with jealousy. How could such an outstanding man be taken by Tong Van Con? V2 Mai was V2 Kiet's younger sister and used to be Tong Van Con's close friend. V2 Mai thought to herself triumphantly, where am I, V2 Mai, inferior to Tong Van Con? If Mr. Mac were to marry, it should be me, V2 Mai. What on earth is Tong Van Con? Hearing V2 Mai say that, the crowd below also fell into an uproar. That's right, I'm also much better than Tong Van Con. CEO Mac, I love you. V2 Mai, who do you think you are? They rushed forward, grabbed V2 Mai's hair, and dragged her down. Mac Hai then cast a cold glance at the crowd. The young ladies below blushed and looked at him shyly. Mac Hai then sneered and looked at V2 Kiet. Thank you very much, young Master V, for loving someone else and leaving Van Con to me. V2 Kiet's face contorted with rage, but he dared not say a word. Tong Van Con frowned, looking at him. Was he just lucky, or was she the one who was blessed? Mac Hai then held Tong Van Con's hand, walked up to him, and asked coldly, Sir, as Tong Van Con's father, do you have any objection to marrying your daughter to me? Tam Gi thought in fear and helplessness. Is this the tone of someone asking a parent for permission? Suddenly, Chu's scream rang out. Tu Kiet, my stomach hurts so much. Tong Van Con glanced at her. V2 Kiet panicked and quickly supported her. Chu, what's wrong? Seeing this, Tong Van Con could not hide her bitterness. Chu said shyly, I'm 2 months pregnant. Mac Hai then covered his mouth and laughed mockingly. In this situation, you still wanted to marry your biological daughter into such a family? I wonder what your scheme was with the V family. After all, Tamgi narrowed his eyes and looked at him coldly. Marrying Tong Van Con to V2 Kiet was for the benefit of both families. But if this Mr. Mac agrees to marry Van Con, he will become my son-in-law. Then RS International will become my strong backing. The entire wedding hall fell into silence. Mac Hai then put his arm around Tong Van Con's waist and said coldly, all right, let's go. He held her hand and walked toward the door. The crowd below automatically stepped back to both sides to make way for him. Tong Van Con held a family photo, her eyes filled with guilt. Grandfather, mother, I'm sorry. V2 Kiet and I have broken up. We won't be getting married. In the photo, a kind-looking, white-haired elderly man and a beautiful woman were holding a lovely baby girl. Mother, I listened to your advice and endured everything, but now I have no way out. She covered her face and burst into tears. I'm only 22 years old. With my current ability, there is no way I can take over the company. Father doesn't like me, and my stepmother and half-sister also hate me. Before, I thought everything would be fine once we took Kiet and I got married, and I could finally leave that house. Grandfather, mother, from now on, I have to plan for myself. Tong Van Con placed her hand on Mac Hai Van's large, strong hand. Mac Hai then sat in the driver's seat and started the car. He kept an eye on her. Seeing her exhausted appearance, he said softly, "Let me take you somewhere to rest for a bit, okay?" Tong Van Con turned her face to look outside and said weakly, "Mr. Mac, thank you so much for helping me today. Could I trouble you to take me home?" Mac Hai then fell silent for a moment and then agreed. Sure. The car sped through the night. At the Tam family villa, Tong Van Con's home, the car stopped in front of the gate. "We're here." Seeing that she said nothing, Hai then turned his head to look at her. Seeing her leaning against the seat, fast asleep in exhaustion, his eyes filled with heartache. It seems she hasn't been living well. Mac Hai then reached out and gently touched Tong Van Con's hair. "Do you need me to go inside with you?" Tong Van Con sleepily opened her eyes. She looked at him and said calmly, "Mr. Mac, let's make a deal. I want to marry you and live at your house. After I turn 25, I will inherit my inheritance, pay back everything I owe you, and then we will get divorced. I will give you half of my inherited estate as a thank you for marrying me now." Mac Hai then let out a soft sigh. Tong Van Con placed her hand on the door handle and said coldly, "I will write a contract specifying our rights and obligations. Ours will be a fake marriage. I will give you 3 days to think about it. I'll wait for your call." She got out of the car and slammed the door shut. Mac Hai then looked at her helplessly. Watching her retreating figure, the corners of his lips curled up slightly. At the Tam villa, Tong Van Con stood in the bathroom with her eyes tightly shut, letting the shower water stream down on her. Over these years, all her thoughts had been focused on V2 Kiet. She recalled all her past grievances, enduring all kinds of insults from them. Now that she and he had broken up, she could no longer return to her former home. A moment later, Tong Van Con wrapped herself in a bath towel, dried her hair, and stepped out. She opened her eyes, silently staring at the wedding gown placed on the chair. In the Tam family dining room, Tong Van Con's half-sister looked at her with a mocking smile. "Oh, today's female lead is back. Sister, you're famous now. Next week, the city's tabloids will all be writing about your wedding today." "Oh wait, that's not right. It wasn't a wedding, because this ceremony didn't succeed." Just then, Tong Van Con's father walked in from outside and said coldly, "All right, Na Van, say a few less words." Seeing him speak up for Tong Van Con, Tam Na Van stood up in anger. "Father, I only want what's best for our family. Her matter has caused such a huge scene. I'm just worried that tomorrow when you go to work, people will gossip about you." Tamgi lovingly stroked her cheek to comfort her. All right, I know you care about me the most." The maid nearby served the rice and smiled awkwardly, saying, "Sir, everyone, please eat. The eldest young lady must be hungry." Tong Van Con's stepmother coughed unhappily. Tamgi took her hint and spoke up. "All right, since things have turned out this way, we won't pursue it anymore. However, your reputation is currently very bad. About you and that Mr. Mac." Tong Van Con curled her lips in a cold sneer. No wonder he didn't lose his temper with me. So this was his motive all along. She placed her hands on the table and replied coldly, "Yes, Mr. Mac and I are together. It was love at first sight, and he is very good to me. We are getting married in 3 days." Tam Navan agitatedly slapped the table. "Impossible. He is the second young Master Mac of RS International. How could he marry a discarded woman like that? You?" Tong Van Con's stepmother spoke coldly to interrupt her. "Navan, look at what you're saying. Don't lose your ladylike demeanor over this. Actually, it's good that Van Con can get married. It's just that RS International's reputation is so huge. If she marries so quickly, people will gossip about us." She scooped a spoonful of sweet rice ball soup and continued, "After all, Van Con is the eldest daughter of the Tong family. The company's high-level executives also don't want the performance." Tamgi set the bowl of sweet rice balls in his hand down on the table and stood up. Her stepmother stood up, looked at him, and asked, "Where are you going? Aren't you going to have some soup?" She took his arm and said gently, "All right, calm down. After all, Van Con already did such a thing, which is quite embarrassing. Sigh, if it were a polite, pure girl like our Na Van marrying into that family, it would be much better. Tong Van Con picked up a sweet rice ball and took a bite. Hearing her words, she snorted coldly, speaking so loudly, it seems she's afraid I won't hear. Tam Na Van glared at her furiously and roared, I'm telling you, Tong Van Con, don't dream of being a wealthy Cinderella anymore. For Cinderella to barely marry into a wealthy family is already quite an achievement, and yet you still have the delusion of marrying a prince? Tam Na Van picked up the soup bowl and sneered. Only a real princess can marry a prince. The soup bowl in her hand crashed to the floor and shattered. Tong Van Con's gaze turned ice cold. Tam Na Van pretended to look frightened. Oh, sister, even if you are unhappy, you shouldn't break the bowl. Tam Gi walked in, glared at her furiously, and scolded, You still dare to smash bowls? Her stepmother looked at her and pretended to say, Van Con, you're already so grown up, but you still haven't fixed your habit of smashing bowls. Tong Van Con angrily slammed her hand on the table. It's only right that I smash it. For so many years, whenever Tam Na Van broke a bowl, even if you all knew it, you would say I broke it. Whatever wrong was done, as long as she didn't admit it, it was blamed on me. From childhood to adulthood, she only gave me what she didn't want, and whatever I had, she absolutely had to snatch away. You always decided things for me, or chose not to give me anything. But today, I want to tell you all, that weak noise was not made by me. If I were to break a bowl, she picked up a bowl and smashed it hard on the floor. It would be like this. The bowl crashed heavily onto the ground and shattered. After doing that, she turned around and walked out, leaving the three people in the dining room staring at her in shock and terror. The bedroom door slammed shut. Outside, furious roars echoed. You brat, get out here. How dare you show off in front of me? Have you rebelled? Aunt Tong, get the keys. That's right, you triggered Mother's heart condition. Sir, there are too many keys. I can't find it. In her room, Tong Van Con sat in front of the computer, crying and praying to heaven. Oh my God. Mac Hai then, you must sign that contract. I've already said things I shouldn't have said. Sobi. Just then, her phone rang. The ringtone played, Hold me, even if we've never been together. An unknown number was calling. Tong Van Con picked up the phone and answered. Hello? On the other end, Mac Hai then asked with a smile, Have you had breakfast yet? I've thought it over. Let's get married. Tong Van Con's face was filled with surprise and joy. Mac Hai then's gentle voice sounded from the other end. Silly girl. Tears rolled down Tong Van Con's face. Mac Hai then, did you specifically calculate the time for me to finish breakfast before calling? Mac Hai then smiled and said, Actually, I also factored in the time for you to take a shower. What's wrong, silly girl? Why aren't you saying anything? Van Con pursed her lips tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. It's nothing. In 2 days, I will come to find you to sign the contract. From the other end of the line, Mac Hai then's worried voice came. Silly girl, are you crying? Tong Van Con raised her hand and hung up the phone. Mac Hai then looked at the dark screen of the phone in his hand in surprise. The butler beside him looked at him and said hurriedly, Second young master, if you go in like this now, if a scene is made, it will attract the paparazzi in this area. Why don't you go back and inform the old master first? He grabbed his arm to stop him. Mac Hai then opened the car door, sat inside, looked at the butler, and said, You are right. I must get grandfather's approval first. Meanwhile, Tong Van Con lay dejectedly on the table. Really, how could I cry like this just because of the concern of someone I've known for less than a day? How embarrassing. She smiled happily, remembering the handsome and gentle face of Mac Hai then. It was because since her grandfather and mother passed away, she had never felt this way again. Stop thinking about it. Since I've made up my mind, I just have to do it. She stood up, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Outside, the butler looked at Mac Hai then and said softly, Second young master, the lights are off. Miss Tong has probably gone to sleep. Sitting in the car, Mac Hai then looked toward the room that had just gone dark and gave a cold grunt. Let's go. Early the next morning, a scream echoed through the Tam residence. Let me out. Standing in her room, Tong Van Con frantically banged on the door and shouted, Release me immediately. On the first floor, Tong Van Con's father picked up his teacup and leisurely savored it. Aunt Tong stood nearby with her head bowed, her face filled with helplessness. I'm sorry, eldest young lady. When under another's roof, one must bow. Once they leave, I will let you out. Tong Van Con screamed in disappointment. Aunt Tong, you betrayed me too and locked my room door. Meanwhile, Tong Van Con's stepmother looked at Tam Na Van and instructed, Later, go with your father to RS International. Remember to behave well. By the way, make sure to keep Tong Van Con's phone secure. Tam Na Van smiled and replied, "Don't worry, Mom. I took it yesterday while she was sleeping, and I've kept it safe all along." Tong Van Con's stepmother looked gently at Tam Na Van, who was beautifully made up and sitting in front of the vanity. "Our Na Van is so beautiful today. Hurry along. Your father is waiting for you." Tam Na Van smiled smugly and nodded. "Okay, Mom." She went downstairs and linked arms with Tam Gi. Tam Gi smiled and said, "Let's go." Na Van is still the obedient one. Marrying her off to the second young Master Mac is also good. After all, Van Con isn't easy to control. Sitting in the car, Tam Na Van smiled at Tam Gi and said, "Thank you, Dad, for taking me to visit RS." Tam Gi smiled dotingly at her. "Silly girl, what are you saying? You're my daughter. If I don't take you, who would I take?" The corner of his mouth curved up slightly. At the RS group building, the receptionist looked at the father and daughter and said politely, "Excuse me, sir, but you cannot meet President Mac without a prior appointment." Tam Gi looked at the receptionist and said calmly, "Tell him I am Tong Van Con's father, bringing my daughter to meet him." In the CEO's office, a white-haired man stretched tiredly and whined, "Boss, you called me in the middle of the night yesterday to torture me. I already let you choose from half of the building, and you're still not satisfied?" Mac Hai then sat at his desk, his eyes never leaving the documents as he replied coldly, "The room you just chose isn't airy. Choose another one." The white-haired man looked straight into his eyes and asked curiously, "Boss, you're being so picky about choosing a house this time. Who is it for?" Mac Hai then smiled gently and replied, "For me and my wife." Hearing this, the white-haired man stared at him in disbelief, his mouth wide open. "Your wife? Since when? Where did she come from?" The assistant nearby glanced at him disdainfully. "The boss already told you that you should read more books and play fewer video games. How could you not see such a trending article on the internet?" As if struck by a massive blow, the white-haired man clutched his chest and sobbed, "Oh my God, my most beloved boss, my closest friend, is married, and I didn't even know. More importantly, I'm not even the best man." Mac Hai then frowned slightly, looking at him helplessly. "All right, if there's nothing else, go do your work." He threw the folder at him. The white-haired man looked at him in heartbroken disbelief. Boss." The assistant nearby gave a dry laugh and spoke up, "Boss, those are my documents." Mac Hai then's cheeks turned red. He gave an embarrassed snort. The white-haired man looked at him in astonishment. He's embarrassed. The 10,000-year iceberg is actually embarrassed to the point of looking foolish? How could he be this pure? Just then, the secretary opened the door, came in, looked at Mac Hai then, and reported, "Boss, someone claiming to be Tong Van Con's father has brought his daughter to see you." Hearing Tong Van Con's name, Mac Hai then's eyes lit up. "All right, go down and receive them." The white-haired man's mouth hung open in shock once again. This was definitely not the usual boss. Mac Hai then picked up a mirror and looked at himself with a gentle smile. Not long after, Tam Gi opened the door and walked in. "President Mac, sorry to bother you." Mac Hai then quickly stood up to greet him. "Mr. Tam, there's no need to be so polite." Fun Con, wearing a pair of luxurious high heels. The beautiful Tam Na Van walked in and smiled gently at him. "Hello, Mr. Mac." Mac Hai then was stunned, his face suddenly darkening. Seeing this, the white-haired man beside him cringed in fear, crying inside, "Is he about to explode? The atmosphere in here doesn't seem right." Furious, Mac Hai then snapped the pen in his hand. "Tevu." Hearing Mac Hai then call his name, Tevu quickly replied, "President Mac." Mac Hai then roared in anger, "Throw them out. Only she herself can use the name Tong Van Con." Tevu walked up to Tam Gi and Tam Na Van and said politely, "Please step outside." Tam Gi grit his teeth in anger. This young Master Mac is just like the rumors, absolutely terrifying. Tam Na Van's theme President Mac, please listen to my explanation. I am the real heir of the Tong Group. Tam Na Van was forcibly dragged out. Tam Gi quickly ran after her. "And how fun." Mac Hai then adjusted his tie and sneered, "She only knows how to copy others." At the door, Tevu coldly escorted Tam Na Van out, then ordered the security guards get them out of the building. With that, he closed the door. Tam Na Van cried her eyes out, her face full of resentment. In the office, Mac Hai then massaged his temples in frustration and said coldly, "Bon Viet, go do the work I just assigned you immediately." I'm only giving you 1 day. In addition, help me investigate Tam Gi and Tong Van Con. Bon Viet took the piece of paper Mac Hai, then wrote for him, and replied calmly, "Yes, President Mac." After Bon Viet left, Mac Hai then looked at Tae Vu and the white-haired man and continued coldly, "Tae Vu, stay behind at the company to attend the meeting with me." The three of them quickly walked out of the office. Tae Vu looked at him as if he wanted to say something, but hesitated. Meanwhile, Mac Hai then anxiously called Tong Van Con. "What's going on with Tam Gi? What kind of person is that stupid woman?" A moment later, Tae Vu opened the office door, looked at Mac Hai then, and said, "President Mac, the old master has arrived at the meeting room." Mac Hai then adjusted his tie and stood up coldly. "Silly girl, you have been my motivation to strive all these years. After going through so many hardships, we've finally met this way. This time, I will take responsibility for your life." Meanwhile, at the Tam Villa, in the living room, Tong Van Con's stepmother sat, receiving VE2 Kiet's parents and VE2 Mai. Her stepmother looked at the three of them and said coldly, "Old Tam and Na Van have gone to take care of some business. Please wait a moment." Vetu Kiet's parents looked at each other. VE2 Kiet's mother set her coffee cup on the table and said awkwardly, "Manlo, we brought 2 Kiet here today to apologize to Van Con." Sitting nearby, VE2 Mai bristled upon hearing this. "Mom, what did my brother do wrong to Tong Van Con?" V2 Kiet's father looked at her and scolded gently, "Van Con is your sister-in-law. You must respect her and not be so disrespectful." Man Lu smiled faintly and said pretentiously, "Dong Fu, her straightforward personality is her strength. I think she's even more outstanding than our Na Van. That's exactly what I like about her." Vetumi smiled smugly. "Thank you, Aunt No." V2 Kiet's mother glanced around and asked softly, "Where is Van Con? Call her down so we can meet. Let 2 Kiet apologize to her. Things have already come to this." Manlu looked at her awkwardly. "If old Tam blames me, you all must speak up for me." V2 Kiet's father looked at her and nodded. Of course, of course." Leaning back in her chair, Manlu glanced at Aunt Tong and ordered, "Aunt Tong, call the eldest young lady down." Hearing this, Aunt Tong walked upstairs. Suddenly, her face paled. Tong Van Con was looking down at her from above with a cold gaze. Seeing Tong Van Con standing on the stairs, Aunt Tong looked at her in surprise. Eldest young lady, looking at the beautiful, cold Tong Van Con standing on the stairs. Aunt Tong looked at her with fear and guilt. Mississippi Tong Van Con brushed past her, placed her hand on Aunt Tong's shoulder, and said calmly, "Aunt Tong, I'm fine." She walked down, casting a proud and cold glance at V2 Kiet's parents. Seeing her, V2 Kiet's mother said with a face full of joy, "Van Con, you're down." Tong Van Con's face darkened. Manlo looked at her, pretending to be kind, and said, "Van Con, Uncle and Aunt Vicky rushed over here early this morning to see you." V2 Kiet stared at her blankly, a flicker of emotion flashing in his eyes. "Van Con." Tong Van Con glanced at them and asked coldly, "Is there something?" V2 Kiet looked at her and quickly apologized. "Van Con, I was wrong." His hands clenched tightly. Frowning deeply, his cheeks flushed red with embarrassment as he lowered his eyes. "I came here today to apologize to you." Tong Van Con knitted her brows. Seeing her proud demeanor, V2 Mai couldn't help but feel extremely jealous. "I really hate that face of hers." Tong Van Con, don't go too far. My brother already apologized, so don't push your luck. V Dong Fu angrily snapped at V2 Mai. "This is none of your business right now. Shut up." With that, he stood up and walked over to Tong Van Con with a smile. "Van Con, I brought 2 Kiet here today to apologize to you. We will set things right for you. The engagement ceremony made you suffer, but when you get married, Uncle will definitely organize a grand wedding for you." Tong Van Con's face darkened, and she coldly interrupted him. "Uncle, I made it clear yesterday. The engagement between V2 Kiet and me is terminated from now on, and we no longer have any relationship." V2 Kiet looked at her in panic. "Van Con, calm down. This was my fault. Our issue is a small matter, but the family alliance is what's important. Even if you're angry with me, you should still think about our parents' feelings." Tong Van Con knitted her brows tightly, staring at him in anger, and roared, "V2 Kiet, when you betrayed me, did you ever think about my feelings?" V Dong Fu, standing behind, quickly tried to comfort her. Van Con. Tu Kiet just doesn't know how to speak. You've known him since childhood. He absolutely didn't mean to do this to you. V2, Kiet's mother also quickly walked over and urged in a low voice, Van Con, listen to Annie. Don't be angry anymore. A person should know when to stop and not go too far. Am I right? Tong Van Con took a step back. Seeing this, V2 shouted angrily. Tong Van Con, don't take a mile when given an inch. Do you expect my brother to kneel down before you're satisfied? Our whole family came to appease you today. What more do you want? Let me tell you, with my brother's status, there's a long line of women waiting to marry into our family. Tong Van Con's eyes welled with tears. She sneered at her. If that's the case, why did you all come looking for me? V. Dong Fu patted his forehead helplessly. I told you to shut up. V2 Kiet's mother sighed softly. Manhwa also spoke up at this moment. Pretending to be the good guy, she looked at her and urged, Van Con, you should still yield and explain everything clearly to everyone. Just then, the front door was pushed open. Manhwa looked at her and continued, acting like this isn't very proper, is it? If we wait until your father gets back, he'll only get angry again. Tamgi walked in, his face pitch black. Manhwa looked at him in surprise. Tong Van Con was also stunned and looked toward the door. Her father, Tamgi, entered the house. He glared at Tong Van Con and roared in anger. I see you think your wings are fully grown now, huh? You don't respect anyone. Don't forget, you're not even 25 yet, so you have no way to take over the company. Walking over to the stairs, he pointed at her face and scolded loudly. This family is not for you to speak. Standing behind, V. Dong Fu gave a forced smile and looked at him. Brother Tam, don't be angry. We came to discuss with Van Con, not to force her. Mrs. Tam, standing nearby, also quickly added, that's right. I believe Van Con is a sensible child and won't refuse. Tong Van Con clenched her fists. She looked at the crowd before her and sneered. How utterly hypocritical. A bunch of people playing good cop and bad cop. All you're missing is a stage. Everyone knows what they're really thinking, so why keep pretending? Tamgi narrowed his eyes and glared at her in rage. What did you say, you wretched girl? Are you rebelling? Lock her in her room immediately. Without my order, no one is allowed to let her out. Tong Van Con frowned and stepped back. Her phone had been taken by Tam Na Van, so she probably couldn't receive Mac Haidan's call. She slapped away the hand about to touch her. Don't touch me. Tong Van Con's eyes welled with tears of fear. If she were locked up now, she didn't know how long she would be kept there. What should she do? Seeing her resist, Tam Gi grew even more furious. You still want to resist? Fine, I will personally drag you back to your room. Just then, the doorbell rang. Everyone in the house looked toward the door in surprise. Who could be coming at this hour? Tam Na Van looked at Tam Gi and said quickly, Dad, hurry and take sister away. What if reporters are here? If she starts talking nonsense again, it will be very embarrassing. As she spoke, she walked over to open the door. Before she could open it, the door was violently pushed open from the outside, slamming hard into her face. Mac Hai then walked in. He parted his lips into a cold smile and looked at everyone. Pardon me for dropping in uninvited. I hope you will be understanding. Clutching her injured face, Tam Na Van smiled gently at him. It's fine, it's fine. Hi Dan, you're here. We are all very happy. Showing no pleasure, Mac Hai then said coldly, Bon Viet, you are failing in your duties. Bon Viet, caught in the crossfire, quickly stepped forward and pushed Tam Na Van aside. Yes, indeed. Clearing the obstacles on the path to marriage for the boss is our duty as subordinates. But boss, you don't need to hide in your shell like that. That's not cute at all. Tamgi looked at him with a forced smile and said, President Mac, you're here. We haven't welcomed you properly. Please sit, please have a seat. Once I finish handling this matter, I will have tea with you. Tong Van Con looked at him silently. Mac Hai then gave a cold laugh. No need. I only came to pick up my fiancée to register our marriage. Tong Van Con's cheeks flushed red, and she looked at him with a touch of emotion. Mac Hai then is really handsome like this. Suddenly, her face darkened. Bon Viet stood behind Mac Hai then, leaned close to Taevu's ear, and whispered, Is the boss serious about this outfit? I remember he really likes this kind of style, but it's from over a decade ago. Mac Hai then walked over to her side. He reached out his hand and smiled gently at her. Silly girl, let's go. Tong Van Con stared in astonishment at the hand extended in front of her. She lowered her head, thinking silently. He is the only one who can save me now. Thinking of this, she threw herself into his arms and said aggrievedly, "Hubby, you're finally here. They were all bullying me." Mac Hai then smiled gently, stroking her hair. "Baby, you've suffered. Hubby is here to take you away. Don't cry anymore." Standing nearby, Bon Viet's eyes widened in shock at this scene. Hey, you two are overacting way too much. It's completely out of character." V2 Kiet lowered his eyes in disappointment. Feng Con, V2 I was so jealous she was driven mad. "Damn it, Hai then is mine. Get away from him." Mac Hai then took Tong Van Con's hand, then looked at Tam Gi with a serious expression. "This girl will be a member of our Mac family from now on. You don't need to worry about the betrothal gifts. When the time comes, my family elders and I will personally deliver them." With that, he pulled her hand to leave. Tam Na Van screamed unwillingly. "Mac Hai then, you can't take her away." Tears rolled down her face, her expression frantic. "She doesn't even like you. Otherwise, why didn't she go when you two scheduled to meet today? She simply didn't want to be with you, which is why she told me to go in her place." Tong Van Con turned her head and snorted coldly at her. Tam Na Van's lies had always been so clumsy since childhood. Seeing her turn around and walk coldly toward her, Tam Na Van trembled in fear. What do you want to do?" Tong Van Con, snatch your phone back from her. "Give me back my phone." "Tam Na Van, you've been stealing my things since childhood." But this time, she turned around, linked arms with Mac Hai Van, and smiled at her provocatively. "Enjoy the painful feeling of having your beloved stolen from you." Tam Na Van's entire body shook. She burst into tears and threw herself into Man Li's arms. Heartbroken, Man Li hugged her to comfort her. "Be good, Na Van, don't cry anymore." The car sped down the highway. Tong Van Con sat in the passenger seat. She sighed softly as she looked at the phone in her hand. "Thank goodness it wasn't broken. Otherwise, I would have had to buy a new one. I only have 5,000 left in my account. I have to spend it carefully." She looked at the meager balance in her account with heartache. Mac Hai Van, who was driving, looked at her and smiled. "So the reason I couldn't reach you when I called was because your phone was taken. Silly girl, I'm glad it wasn't because you deliberately ignore my calls." He draped his arm over her shoulders and pulled her close to him. Tung Feng Con's cheeks flushed in embarrassment. "What are you saying? Am I the kind of person who doesn't keep a promise?" Mac Hai then looked surprised. He stroked her cheek gently, filled with joy. "So that's how it is." He opened the car door, walked around to the passenger side, and helped her out. Holding hands, they walked inside. Looking at the marriage registration office, Mac Hai then smiled and said, "Silly girl, let's go inside." Tong Van Con looked up at the marriage registration office, her heart in turmoil. It seemed there was no turning back now. Mac Hai then held her hand tightly and led her inside. Suddenly, Tong Van Con cried out, "Wait a minute." Mac Hai then was startled, his entire body freezing up. He turned his head mechanically, looking at her in dismay. "What's wrong, silly girl? Don't tell me you don't agree." With a pitiful expression, Mac Hai then pursed his lips and stared at her. Tong Van Con bit her lip, trying hard to suppress a laugh. Seeing him look so pitiful, she really couldn't bear to tease him. But she turned her head and calmly said, "Although getting married is my wish, you agreed to it anyway. As for the betrothal gifts, you already know my family situation. Once they receive them, they won't prepare a dowry for me. I can only prepare myself, but it won't be much." Mac Hai then looked at her in surprise. "So that was how it was." He smiled and patted her head. "Silly girl, if you have any requests, you can tell me directly. No need to beat around the bush like this." Tong Van Con's eyes lit up. She smiled happily at him and said without hesitation, "Transfer 10 million to my account first. Otherwise, I won't get married." After saying that, she immediately regretted it. "Oh no, will he think I'm an easy person? But I really have no money left, and I can't sleep on the streets, right? Tong Van Con, wake up. Why do you care what he thinks? Every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost." Mac Hai then sighed and replied, "Okay." Tong Van Con looked at him in astonishment. Mac Hai then smiled and continued, "That's way too cheap." Tong Van Con felt like she was about to explode. "What? He thinks it's too little." She held her face, crying without tears. What? Too cheap? Too cheap." Seeing her expression, Mac Hai then couldn't help but burst into laughter. He hugged her, gently rubbing her head. "Baby, you are indeed Elder Tong's granddaughter. You know how to spend other people's money on yourself. Using your husband's money to buy your own dowry. You're really adorable, baby." A moment later, the camera clicked several times. Tong Van Con and Mac Hai then took a photo together to print on their marriage certificate. Okay, get ready. Tong Van Con secretly glanced at him. The eyes of both could not hide their happiness. Mac Hai then leaned close to her ear and whispered, "Baby, your husband feels that when buying your own dowry, you don't need to save so much. How about this? I'll transfer $200 million to you first, see if that's enough." Both of Tong Van Con's cheeks lit up. The photographer smiled at the two. Okay, seeing her own radiant smile, Tong Van Con wished she could find a hole to crawl into. This smile that lights up at the sight of money is really too embarrassing. But she held Mac Hai Than's hand and softly said, just let me off by the side of the road. I won't bother you anymore." Mac Hai then frowned and looked at her. He put his arm around her shoulders and smiled with a smile. "What are you saying, baby? Look, we've already arrived home." Tong Fan Con gasped in surprise. "Hey," she smiled awkwardly at him and quickly said, We're just in a fake marriage. There's no need to go this far, right?" The smile on Mac Hai Than's face stiffened. "What do you think, baby?" Tong Van Con was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. "No way, right?" The car stopped in the dark night. Mac Hai then held the marriage certificate in his hands, his face full of gloom. "We've clearly obtained our marriage certificate already. Baby, please don't abandon me, okay?" Tong Van Con laughed awkwardly and replied, "Ow. Although that's true, we still have a prenuptial agreement. Let me get it to show you." She couldn't find her handbag. Tong Van Con's face was completely blank. "Huh?" She cried without tears. "Is my handbag still on the chair in my room?" Tong Van Con turned her head to look at him and hastily asked, "Excuse me, is it too late for me to write another one now?" Mac Hai then looked at her with a devilish smile. "What do you think, my little wife?" Tong Van Con got goosebumps. She looked at him for a moment, tears welling up in her eyes, looking as aggrieved as could be. "You're bullying me." She turned her face away and burst into tears. "You're bullying me too much. I just got out of the tiger's den only to enter a wolf's lair. You're a perverted bastard." Mac Hai then laughed helplessly and quickly coaxed her. Yes, I was wrong. I said the wrong thing. Please don't cry, okay?" Tong Van Con covered her face and sobbed a few times, thinking to herself, "No matter what, I should stay here first and talk later. I'm really a clever little devil." Seeing Mac Hai then coming close, Tong Van Con was startled. "Wait, what are you trying to do?" Mac Hai then said nothing. He leaned down and kissed her lips. Tong Van Con was stunned, her eyes red as she looked at him in surprise. She slowly closed her eyes and accepted his kiss. Suddenly, the car door was pulled open. The butler looked at them with slight embarrassment and said calmly, "Ahem, young master, young mistress, welcome back." Tong Van Con was embarrassed, her cheeks burning red. She hastily pushed Mac Hai Than away. "WH, what are you doing?" Mac Hai Than smiled, took her hand, and kissed it gently. "My wife is indeed a straightforward little baby, just like when you were a child. Every time you cried, all it took was a kiss to make you stop." Tong Van Con looked at him in astonishment. How did you know Mac Hai Than?" Without saying a word, he lifted her up in his arms. Tong Van Con looked at him in embarrassment and quickly said, "Why are you carrying me? I can walk on my own." Mac Hai Than smiled and teased her, "No way. My wife is a little baby now. Not only do I have to kiss you, but I also have to hold you and lift you high." Tong Van Con was embarrassed, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. "Stop talking, it's so embarrassing." Mac Hai then carried her inside under everyone's astonished eyes. In the bathroom, water filled the bathtub. Tong Van Con sat in the tub, relaxing comfortably. In the end, I miraculously ended up staying here anyway. Embarrassed, she shrank down into the water. If it weren't for the fact that he grew up looking rather handsome, I would have beaten him up long ago. Tong Van Con, what are you thinking? Wake up. How can you be seduced by good looks? She was so embarrassed that she splashed the water repeatedly. No, I have to talk to him. He agreed to marry me so easily. There must be a purpose. I must clarify the conditions first. She stepped out of the bathtub. Unfortunately, she slipped and fell backward. Hearing her scream, Mac Hai then hurriedly opened the door and rushed in. "What happened?" Tong Van Con cried out in her heart. "It's over. I'm about to fall and end up crippled. Mac Hai then definitely won't want me anymore." Mac Hai then quickly ran over, grabbed her hand, and supported her. "Careful, baby." Their eyes met. Tong Van Con was embarrassed and quickly looked away. Thank you." The bath towel on her body suddenly fell to the floor. The atmosphere in the bathroom became extremely awkward. Mac Hai Than's face turned beet red. He unconsciously swallowed hard. No way. Oh heavens. Please don't play with me like this, okay? Tong Van Con tightly hugged her body, her small face flushing red as she looked at him in embarrassment. Mac Hai then approached her. Terrified and embarrassed, Tong Van Con squeezed her eyes shut. What should I do? I, Tong Van Con, since childhood, may not have been exceptionally scholarly, but I can still be considered well-read and knowledgeable. But who can tell me what to do in this situation? Should I pick it up or not? But I don't have any free hands left. Mac Hai then picked up the bath towel from the floor. Then he wrapped it around Tong Van Con. His face flushed red. He looked at her and said gently, "Don't worry, baby, I have no bad intentions." Tong Van Con smiled awkwardly and replied, "I know, I didn't doubt you at all." She looked down, her face turning even redder. What is that hard thing? But could you not poke me with your thigh like that? Mac Hai then was startled. He covered his crotch, quickly backed away, and said in a panic, I don't. You're mistaken. I'll go out first. How embarrassing. Looking at Mac Hai, then awkwardly leaving the bathroom, Tong Van Con smiled mischievously at him. And you say you have no intentions. That has absolutely no credibility. Ha ha. On this side, Mac Hai then let out a long sigh and stared at the bathroom door. A maid came over, looked at him, and asked softly, "Young master, would you like to take a bath?" Mac Hai then turned around and said coldly, "Clean up an adjacent room for me." The maid replied in a low voice, "Yes, young master." In the luxurious bedroom, Tong Van Con stepped out of the bathroom, drying her hair as she walked. That was too dangerous. We almost crossed the line. But Mac Hai then can still be considered a true gentleman. Mac Hai then opened the door, looked at her, and asked, "Can I come in?" Tong Van Con nodded and replied, "Come in." Mac Hai then looked at her, his face full of embarrassment. "Baby, get ready a bit, we." Tong Van Con touched his face in surprise, asking with concern, "What are you doing? Why are you sweating so much?" Mac Hai then's cheeks flushed red, and he looked at her helplessly. "Baby, if you don't want little Mac Hai then to come out and greet you, you'd better not tease me right now." Tong Van Con was startled, her small face turning beet red. Little Mac Hai then. She imagined the scene of little Mac Hai then suddenly appearing. "Hi, Sister Van Con, please look after me in the future." Her eyes lit up. My pure soul has been corrupted by him. Tong Van Con excitedly punched him repeatedly. The image is in my head now. Mac Hai then burst into laughter and looked at her gently. "My wife, you are really adorable." He gently cupped her chin and lifted it. Mac Hai then suddenly leaned down and kissed her lips. Although little Mac Hai then isn't greeting you for now. As for the big Mac Hai then, my wife, you will have to take care of him a lot in the future. He gently kissed her forehead. Touched, Tong Van Con's eyes welled with tears, and she whispered, "Who wants to take care of you?" Just then, the maid came over and said softly, "Young master, the gown is ready." "Young mistress, please try it on." Mac Hai then pinched Tong Van Con's cheek and smiled. "All right, we have to attend a banquet today. I'm taking you to meet grandfather." Tong Van Con was startled. "Meet grandfather? That's right. How could I forget this? Even though it's a fake marriage, I still have to leave a good impression on the elder of the Mac family." Looking at the tacky purple dress in front of her, Tong Van Con's face darkened. Mac Hai then stood behind her, watching her expression, secretly laughing so hard his body shook. Tong Van Con cried without tears. "It's so ugly. If I wear this, it will only make grandfather agitated enough to hit me." Tong Van Con clutched her chest and let out a sigh. "Oh my, I feel a bit unwell. I need a rest. I'm not going to the banquet anymore." She collapsed onto the bed, her cheeks flushed. "Whoever wants to go can go. I can't pull this off." Mac Hai then sat down by the bed and gently patted her head. Tong Van Con raised her head, looked at him, and asked, "What are you doing? Why didn't you wake me up? What if we're late?" Mac Hai then doted on her, pulling her into his arms. "You're my wife now, so of course I will listen to you. Whither the husband goes, the wife follows. If you don't go, I won't go either." Tong Van Con hugged him tightly, burying her head in his shoulder. Her face flushed red and her heart filled with emotion. But outwardly, she remained stubborn. I don't like that gown." Mac Hai then burst out laughing and pinched her cheek. "I was just teasing you." Then he turned to the door and ordered the maid, "Take the young mistress to change into the real gown." Tong Van Con stood up and followed the maid out, saying as she walked, "If it's another strange style, I'm really not going." After she left, Mac Hai then turned around. He walked over and gently touched the tacky purple gown, his eyes solemn. "Van Con, there will come a day when you will wear this, but not now." In the banquet hall, everyone had gathered and was chatting with each other. Tong Van Con walked in with Mac Hai then. She nervously gripped his arm. Mac Hai then smiled and gently reassured her, "It's okay, don't be nervous." Tong Van Con, having been seen through by him, turned her face away in embarrassment. "Who's nervous? I'm a daughter of a prestigious family after all. Do you think I've never seen such a scene before?" The doors to the banquet hall opened, and the two walked in arm in arm. Tong Van Con pursed her lips, telling herself, "It's okay. From now on, I am no longer just Tong Van Con. I am Neo Haru Van Con." Everyone in the banquet hall turned around in surprise, staring at the two of them. Seeing so many eyes on her, Tong Van Con felt embarrassed, her small face flushing red. She tried to put on a forced smile as she walked in with Mac Hai then. An old man with white hair came over, looking at them with a happy smile. "You guys are here." Mac Hai then looked at him and said softly, "Grandfather." Tong Van Con stood beside him and greeted politely, "Hello, Grandfather Mac." Elder Mac smiled at her. "No wonder Hai then convinced me in such a hurry. He wanted to marry you. Not bad. You're a well-mannered child." Tong Van Con looked at Mac Hai then in surprise. So he had already mentioned this to Elder Mac in advance. That makes sense. How could the young master of such a large corporation marry just like that? She lowered her face gloomily. Elder Mac patted Mac Hai than's shoulder and said seriously, "But you are finally settled down now. Seeing you hang out with that man family kid every day all these years, I was really worried about your sexual orientation." Mac Hai then laughed helplessly. "Grandfather." Elder Mac turned around and walked towards the party, saying happily, "But seeing that you married a woman makes me feel relieved." The surrounding people looked at Tong Van Con, whispering in surprise. On TV, they also said that the current wife of young Master Mac is the one who was previously engaged to the VE family. Really? Then isn't she secondhand goods? Tong Van Con clenched her fists, her lips trembling violently. Mac Hai then felt pained, gently placing his hand on her shoulder to comfort her. He slid his hand down and tightly clasped her hand, pulling her over to the people who had just been gossiping. "What's the matter, you two? Is today's food and wine not to your taste? How do you have so much energy to talk so much?" The green-haired man smiled embarrassedly and stammered, "Not at all, present Mac. Being invited here by you is already our honor." Mac Hai then narrowed his eyes, looking at them coldly. "Your honor is to step on my carpet and badmouth my family? You really know how to enjoy this honor." Everyone at the banquet began whispering and criticizing the couple. The man and woman flushed red with shame and quickly explained in embarrassment, "Young Master Mac, you are speaking too harshly. We were also just listening to rumors. We heard that Miss Tong and the young master of the VE family were childhood sweethearts." Mac Hai then pulled Tong Van Con tightly into his arms and said coldly, "Childhood sweethearts might be a stretch. As for lovers," he gently lifted her chin and smiled as he continued, "My wife and I have liked each other since childhood. With me around, would she still choose him? Is my wife's big, beautiful pair of eyes just for decoration?" Tong Van Con frowned, looking at him unhappily. "Although he's helping me out, why does words sound so forced? He's clearly calling me blind." The woman who had badmouthed Tong Van Con frowned, guiltily looking at the green-haired man. Right. Could there be another side to this story?" At this moment, an attractive red-haired woman stepped out from the crowd and said mockingly, "That's right. During the wedding, didn't they release photos of young Master VE with another woman? About to get married and still behaving so shamelessly. He's clearly no good either." "Exactly. If they really liked each other, how could he be with another woman? I heard that during the wedding, that woman was the bridesmaid and was even pregnant. Isn't that too disgusting? Isn't that too timing? What does this VE family actually want? Could it really be for money?" Mac Hai then held Tong Van Con tightly in his arms, his eyes full of tenderness. "It's because I didn't take good care of my wife, allowing her to be set up by the VE family. But if young Master VE really loved my wife, how could he be with another woman? Not keeping oneself pure for his wife. How is that any different from a breeding pig in heat?" He hugged her tightly, his face full of heartache. Con, it was my fault for not protecting you well in the past. In the future, I will never let you suffer any more grievances." Lying in his arms, Tong Van Con snickered. "This is so satisfying." A moment later, Mac Hai then let go of Tong Van Con, looking at the couple with cold eyes. "We originally didn't want to bring this up again, fearing it would hurt my wife. But since everyone brought it up today, as her husband, I naturally cannot stand by." The couple laughed awkwardly and replied, Yes, we know now. Miss Tong is innocent. It was all the VE family's fault. It was a misunderstanding, all a misunderstanding. Everyone understands now." The young ladies around also looked at her with sympathy and said angrily, "That's right. The VE family forced a marriage for their own benefit. Their character is atrocious. We won't cooperate with them in the future. Mac Hai then nodded, rubbing his chin with a thoughtful look. You all are indeed sensible people. However, regarding today's matter, Tong Van Con suddenly took his hand and said gently, our family is hosting a banquet. What could possibly be wrong? Everyone is just chatting and having a little fun. The surrounding people also chimed in. Exactly, young Mistress Mac is really magnanimous. She and young Master Mac are truly a perfect match. Elder Mac stood in the distance, smiling with satisfaction and nodding. Elsewhere, vedonfu angrily slekt vetu kiet. Look at what you've done. The internet is flooded with articles criticizing V2 Kiet, ranking him as a scumbag, and calling him a gold-digging marriage fraudster of Sotan Corporation. Slapped by V Dong Fu, V2 Kiet yelled with resentment. Dad, what are you doing? Tong Van Con set me up. Why are you hitting me? Chu Chu stood by his side, holding his hand to persuade him. Tu Kiet, don't talk back to Dad. It's all my fault. V Tumai walked over, glared at her, and yelled angrily, who is your father? Don't think that just because you are pregnant, you can enter our family's door. Chu Chu lowered her eyes filled with tears as she feigned pity, saying, I'm sorry, because Uncle and Aunt have both been so good to me. In my heart, I already regarded everyone as my family, and for a moment I forgot. I'm sorry, it's all my fault. Mrs. V crossed her arms and sneered. Where did those words come from? We have never taken care of you. We wouldn't dare accept you calling him Dad. V2 Kiet put his arm around Tu Chu's shoulders, standing up to protect her. Mother, Tu Chu is pregnant. Can't everyone be a bit more tolerant? Hearing him say that, V Dong Fu grew even angrier. It is precisely because she is pregnant with this child that we let her stay here. Otherwise, we would have kicked her out long ago. Terrified, Chu Chu hid behind V2 Kiet's back, clutching his hand and sobbing, Tu Kiet, don't say anymore. It's my fault. I shouldn't have loved you. I shouldn't have gotten pregnant with your child. Vetu Kiet frowned deeply. Chu Chu lowered her eyes, her expression desolate. I've decided. Let's break up. With that, she turned and ran away. V2 Kiet was startled and quickly chased after her. Chu Chu, don't be impulsive. Chu Chu. V Tumai frowned and looked at V Dong Fu unhappily. Father, look at him. He was seduced and blinded by that vixen. V Dong Fu glared at her angrily. You still dare to speak? At the wedding, if you hadn't helped them, would we be in this situation today? V Tumai felt guilty, tapping her fingers together. How could I have known back then that Tong Van Con would inherit such a large fortune? No one told me either. V Dong Fu sat down exhaustedly, holding his forehead. What a family misfortune. Madame V sat down next to him, frowning, and said, don't be angry anymore. The only solution right now is to get Tong Van Con to come back. V Tumai also sat down, hugging the pillow next to her, her face full of anger. It's all Tong Van Con's fault. Meanwhile, Tong Van Con was sitting on the bed, staring at the phone in her hand. Suddenly, she sneezed. A large hand pressed against her forehead. Tung Van Con was startled. Oh, Mac Hai then looked at her with concern and asked, you didn't catch a cold, did you? Let hubby check. Tong Van Con felt embarrassed and quickly pushed him away. What are you doing? Her cheeks flushed red as she lay flat on the bed. It's all your fault for telling me to go to that damn banquet. The gown had so little fabric, I nearly froze to death. Mac Hai then laughed, affectionately stroking her head. All right, it's all my fault. My little wife, don't be angry anymore. Let's take some medicine, okay? Tong Van Con sat up, curling her legs, and pouted. I don't want to. The medicine is so bitter, I'm not drinking it. Mac Hai then smiled gently, stroking her head and coaxing patiently. Be good. If you don't take it, you won't recover from your cold. Tong Van Con looked up at him and asked, who says so? Since I was little, I've never taken cold medicine. Do you know why? Because no one cared whether I had a cold or not. Sometimes they probably even thought it would be better if my brain burned up from a fever. That way, they could control me as they pleased. Mac Hai then was startled, looking at her with heartache. Tong Van Con turned her back and continued with a smile, but Aunt Tong cared about me a lot. She always followed me around to tell me to take my medicine. But since I was the young mistress, she couldn't force me to take it, so I still had a bit of human rights, right? Heartbroken, Mac Hai then hugged her. It's all right now. Tung Van Con was startled. Huh? Mac Hai then hugged her tightly and said gently, I promise you that those dark and difficult days will never happen again. You are my wife, the person I love most in this life. So no matter what happens, I will be by your side. He leaned down and placed a kiss on her lips. Tong Van Con was moved to tears. Really? Of course. Meanwhile, in the Mac household, a loud cough rang out. Tong Van Con patted Mac Hythan's back and said helplessly, Tu Hung, go ahead and bring the cold medicine over. Who told your young master to insist on staying by my side, even when he's sick? Chu Hung gave a dry laugh and replied, Yes, young madam. Tong Van Con brought a cup of warm water to the bedside and handed it to Mac Hythan. Mac Hai then lay on the bed with his eyes tightly shut, muttering in his delirium, Tin Nu, don't go. Tung Feng Con was startled. Who was Tin Nu? Was she the one he liked? Her heart ached, and her eyes welled up with tears. Ours is only a contract marriage, a transaction, not love. The sweet words he said were probably just because he wanted me to be his lover. That's right, I need to wake up. She placed the cup of water on the table, turned around, and walked out. A moment later, Mac Hai then walked out, looked at her, and said with a smile, I'm awake. The medicine has gone cold. Why didn't you wake me up to drink it? Tong Van Con recalled the name he had just called out. Tin Nu, don't go. She tried to suppress the emotions in her heart, raised her head with a smile, looked at him, and replied, You looked like you were sleeping so soundly, so I didn't wake you. Mac Hai then picked up the bowl of medicine, handed it to her, and acted spoiled. Feed me. Tong Van Con picked up the bowl of medicine and laughed helplessly. Childish. Suddenly, the phone next to them vibrated. Mac Hai then picked it up and pressed answer. The voice on the other end said hurriedly, Hey Mac, Tin Nu is drunk at my place. She's back, but she doesn't dare to go see you. Mac Hai then was shocked. Tin Nu is back? She left for 2 years, and she's finally back? Tong Van Con lowered her eyes, a hint of loneliness on her face. Ding Nu, that name again. The voice on the other end continued, Come quickly. She's drunk and keeps calling for you. I tried to advise her, but it's no use. Mac Hai then replied blankly, All right. He hung up, quickly put on his coat, and said, I'm going to meet a friend. Tong Van Con sat on the chair and looked at him in silence. A friend? The person whose name you called in your sleep is just a friend? The sound of the door closing rang out. Tong Van Con poured the bowl of medicine onto the floor, her face darkening. After all, I'm just using him, wanting back everything that belongs to me. Whoever he loves has nothing to do with me. At the Drunken Dream Bar, a blonde-haired man sat next to a beautiful girl. Seeing Mac Hythan arrive, he raised his hand and called out loudly, Mac, over here. Tin Nu is drunk. Come over and check on her. The woman named Tin Nu, slightly tipsy, held a wine glass in her hand. Mac Hythan walked over, sat down next to her, and called softly, Tin Nu, why did you drink so much? Don't you know you can't drink? Tin Nu tilted her head and leaned on his shoulder. She looked up at Mac Hythan and asked stubbornly, Hythan, I missed you so much. Did you miss me? Mac Hythan looked at her and said softly, I'll take you home. Tin Nu turned her head away in excitement and shook her head. I'm not going back. I can't let father see me like this. Then, she weakly leaned on Mac Hythan's shoulder. She's always like this. The blond man beside them gave a suggestive smile, looking at the two. Oh, zo dazzling, do dazzling. Rekindling an old flame. It wasn't easy for Tin Nu to return. Why don't you take this chance to spend more time together? Mac Hythan looked at him and said calmly, I'm married. The blond man spat out the wine he had just swallowed. Don't joke around. Really? Who on earth is she? Why didn't you wait for Tin Nu to come back? Tin Nu lay in his arms with a sad face. He's married? Who is she? Only I can be Mrs. Mac. Hythan picked Tin Nu up, looked at the blond man, and said flatly, I'll take her home. The luxury car sped through the dark night. Tin Nu sat in the passenger seat and let out a soft groan. MH cold. Mac Hai then took off his coat, draped it over her, and asked gently, Tin Nu, where do you live? I'll take you home. Tin Nu shut her eyes tightly and muttered, Don't make a fuss. Mac Hai then looked at her and sighed. Drinking this much every single time, you won't wake up anytime soon. Meanwhile, at the Mac household, Tin Nu sat in the passenger seat, slightly opening her eyes, secretly looking at Mac Hythan. Hythan is still so handsome. Will he take me to his house? Is it true or fake that he's married? The doorbell of the house rang. Tong Van Con was startled and turned her head toward the door. Overjoyed, she quickly ran to open it. Mac Hythan, you're back. The door opened, and Tong Van Con's joyful expression turned to disappointment. Mac Hythan, holding the drunk Tin Nu, looked at her, smiled, and said, Van Con, I'm back. Tong Van Con stood at the door, looking at Tin Nu supported in Mac Hythan's arms, and asked hesitantly, Who is this? Mac Hythan smiled and looked at her calmly. Tin Nu frowned, looking at Tong Van Con vigilantly. Why is there a woman in Hythan's house? Could Hythan really be married? Mac Hai then looked at Tong Van Con and explained, she's drunk. It's not safe to leave her alone. Let's have her stay here today. Tong Van Con lowered her eyes and gave a soft okay. Mac Hai then supported Tin Nu and walked past her into the house. Tin Nu, resting in Mac Hai then's arms, smiled smugly. So what if he's married? Isn't Hai then still treating me well? In the guest bedroom, Mac Hai then carefully tucked Tin Nu in. Just as he was about to leave, a hand suddenly grabbed his hand. Tin Nu opened her eyes, looked at him, and pleaded, "Don't go." Hai then don't go. Standing outside, Tong Van Con's face darkened. Yes, I should wake up now. This is his house. He can bring back whoever he wants. What right do I have to refuse? When Hai then walked out, he chuckled and flicked her forehead. What are you standing here blankly for, silly? Tong Van Con raised her head in surprise, her heart aching. Is he ordering me to leave? Seeing his calm and indifferent look, Tong Van Con lowered her eyes in disappointment. That's right. He wants to be alone in a world of two with that Tin Nu. I get it. I won't disturb the two of you. Mac Hai then was startled and looked at her in confusion. Anxious and panicked, he quickly asked, "Where are you going?" Tong Van Con ran off, trying hard to hold back her tears. I know. I will stay far away from you too, so I won't be a third wheel. She ran quickly back to her room, tears falling uncontrollably. Why am I crying? I don't want to be like this. Mac Hai then hurriedly chased after Tong Van Con. Just as she was about to close the door, he quickly raised his hand to stop her. What are you doing? Aren't you going to wait for me to come in? Tong Van Con looked at him in surprise and asked, Aren't you sleeping in your room? Go on. She seems to really need you. Mac Hai then rubbed his chin and replied calmly, Didn't I give my room to Tin Nu already? I can only sleep with my little van. Tong Van Con was startled. Huh? Mac Hai then held her shoulders and asked gently, Is that not okay? Do you have the heart to make me sleep on the sofa? Little Van. Tong Van Con turned her face away and said in a low voice, Staying in my room is fine, but you can't do anything else. Mac Hai then held her shoulders firmly and gently kissed her forehead. Okay, I promise. Tong Van Con, seeing that he wasn't paying attention to her words, couldn't take it anymore and shouted emotionally, Are you even listening to me? Right at that moment, Tin Nu suddenly burst in, looking at them in disbelief. Hi then, you too. Mac Hai then held Tong Van Con's hand tightly, smiled at Tin Nu, and asked, Are you awake? Looking at Tin Nu's wary and hostile eyes, Tong Van Con lowered her eyes, clearly sensing her enmity. Mac Hai then looked at Tong Van Con gently and introduced her to Tin Nu. She is my wife. Tong Van Con's cheeks flushed red, and her face was blank. She didn't expect him to say that, saying that will make her angry. Could he be saying it on purpose? Just wanted to use me to make her jealous? Standing outside the door, Tin Nu clenched her fists. She didn't expect Hai then to admit it so directly. Wait, could Hai then be intentionally making me jealous to test my reaction? Her eyes suddenly lit up and she pretended to cry, looking at Mac Hai then in heartbreak and questioning him. Hai then, you're married? Why? Why didn't you wait for me to return? Tong Van Con looked at Mac Hai then and sneered mockingly. Look at that. The little beauty has been driven to tears by you. Go comfort her quickly. But Mac Hai then did the opposite. He laughed and said to Tin Nu, If you don't want to stay here, I can take you back now. Hearing him say this, Tin Nu was so shocked she forgot to cry, staring at him. Hai then, panic suddenly gripped her heart. Could Hai then really not care about me anymore? Tin Nu screamed hysterically. No need, I'll go by myself. After saying that, she snorted coldly, turned around, and ran away. Fine, I'll bet on this. I don't believe Hai then won't worry about me. Mac Hai then quickly called out to her. Tin Nu. Tong Van Con looked at him, her heart aching. You made her run off in anger, and now you're worried? Men are all pigs. She pushed him toward the door and said coldly, Go see her off. I'm going to sleep first. Mac Hai then hugged her, smiling dotingly. My wife is still the most sensible. It's not safe for her to be alone outside. It's so late, and she won't be able to hail a cab. Tong Van Con took his hand, pressed it to her cheek, and urged in a low voice, Go. I'll wait for you. Watching Mac Hai then chase after Tin Nu, Tong Van Con closed the door. She leaned against the large door, her eyes tightly shut, her heart sinking, making up so many excuses. But in the end, didn't you still choose to run after her? She mocked herself. The night was pitch black. Tin Nu stood under the street lamp, her heart anxious. She stood there for a long time, but Mac Hai then still hadn't chased after her. She lowered her head in disappointment. Why hasn't he come yet? Could Hai then really not worry about me anymore? Mac Hai then drove up and saw Tin Nu standing by the road. He let out a sigh of relief. Found her. He parked the car next to her and said flatly, "Get in. I'll take you home." Tin Nu's eyes lit up with joy. "Hi then, you're here." She quickly got in the car and hugged his arm tightly. "Hi then, I knew you wouldn't abandon me." He looked at her and said calmly, "Don't misunderstand. It's just for the sake of our friendship. I was worried about leaving you alone this late." In a panic, Tin Nu grabbed his hand. "Friendship? Our feelings for each other. Do you not have even a bit of attachment left?" Mac Hai then turned his face away and reminded her once more, "I'm married. Between us, it can only be friendship." Tin Nu's entire body trembled. She sat back in the passenger seat in disappointment. "As long as I can be by his side, even as just friends, I am willing. After some time, he will surely remember our past sweetness." Thinking of this, she calmed her emotions, looked at him, and said, "Fine, I will give you too my blessing. Just don't be so cold to me, okay?" Mac Hai then smiled and patted her head. "All right, where are you staying? I'll take you there." The car stopped in front of an apartment building. Mac Hai then looked outside in surprise. "This is..." He turned his head and asked Tin Nu in astonishment, "You live here?" Tin Nu smiled shyly and nodded. "Yeah, we used to live here together, so I still wanted to keep it exactly the way it was." She winked and smiled brightly, looking at him playfully. "Want to come up and sit for a bit? It's still our old room, and I haven't touched any of the things inside." Mac Hai then got out of the car, his brow furrowing slightly, and declined Tin Nu's invitation to go up. "No, I have to go back. My wife is still waiting for me at home." Tin Nu bit her lip hard, her face filled with resentment. His wife? Her again. "Tonight, I must make Hai then stay." She pretended to look downcast, saying sadly, "Didn't you say we're friends? A friend going upstairs for a cup of tea? Why are you being so formal? Can I not even be considered a friend in your heart?" Hearing this, Mac Hai then sighed softly. "That's true. Being too guarded makes it stranger instead." Thinking so, he agreed. "All right then." The apartment door was opened. Tin Nu went into the kitchen to pour him a glass of water. "Sit down. I'll brew some tea for you. I'll brew the Bilyuakun tea you like to drink, okay?" Mac Hai then sat on the sofa and replied flatly, "Okay." Tin Nu turned her head and smiled triumphantly, dropping 2 pills into the teacup. "Tonight, I will definitely make you stay." A moment later, Tin Nu brought the teacup out and placed it on the table in front of Mac Hai then. "Drink it while it's hot. Hai then." Mac Hai then looked at her, smiled, and replied, "Thanks." Tin Nu smiled gently and said, "Don't mention it." Watching Mac Hai then pick up the teacup and drink, the corner of Tin Nu's lips curled up slightly. "Drink, drink more." Seeing him take a big gulp, Tin Nu picked up another teacup and smiled deviously. A moment later, seeing Mac Hai then stagger and hold his head, Tin Nu put down the teacup in her hand. She snuggled into his chest and said coaxingly, "We used to sit like this and watch movies together. Do you remember?" Mac Hai then's cheeks flushed red, his eyes glassy as he groaned softly. "What's wrong with me? I'm so sleepy." Tin Nu hugged his arm tightly, smiling contentedly. "Sleep, my Hai then. In the end, you are still mine." At the Mac household, Tong Van Con held her phone, her face pale. "It's already this late. Hai then." On the other side, seeing Mac Hai then leave coldly, Tin Nu called out to him in panic, "Hai then, don't go." Mac Hai then held his face and staggered away, his expression full of disappointment. Tin Nu, how could she do such a thing? Sleeping pills. I must get back quickly. Van Con is still waiting for me at home. If I'm late, she will definitely be angry. Thinking of her angry look with wide eyes and puffed cheeks, Mac Hai then's face relaxed. He smiled dotingly. Even when she's angry, she's so cute. Mac Hai then drove home. The sleeping pills had taken effect, making it impossible for him to focus. A large truck from the opposite direction sped toward him. Mac Hai then's face paled. "Oh no." On the other side, Tong Van Con sat on the bed, angrily slamming the pillow onto the mattress repeatedly. "Mac Hai then, if you don't come home, I'm going out to find some handsome guys. You're driving me crazy." Suddenly, the phone on her table rang. She quickly pressed answer, saying angrily, "What's wrong? Did you not bring your keys? I thought you weren't coming back. I'm not opening the door for you." An unfamiliar voice spoke on the other end. Are you Mrs. Mack? Mr. Mack has been in an accident. Please come over quickly. Tong Van Con's face turned pale, and she stammered. What did you say? An accident? She hurriedly put on her shoes and rushed out. How could he have an accident? Mack Hai then won't be seriously injured, will he? Mack Hai then, I don't want to be a widow. You must not. Then, at the emergency room, Tong Van Con rushed in frantically. She opened the ward door, looked at Mack Hai, then lying on the hospital bed, and called out anxiously, Mack Hai then. The doctor looked at her, sighed, and said, Mrs. Mack, because of the heavy impact, he has not regained consciousness yet. There is a possibility. Tong Van Con knelt by the hospital bed, clutching his hand tightly and crying loudly, Mack Hai then, you can't die. If you die, what am I going to do? Didn't you say you'd give me happiness? If you die, I'll become a widow. I don't want to be a widow at such a young age. Wake up for me. The doctor standing behind pushed his glasses up, looking at her in surprise. I hadn't finished my sentence. There's a possibility he will regain consciousness immediately. Mack Hai then, lying on the bed, let the corners of his mouth twitch up slightly. My little wife is worried. With tears streaming down her face, Tong Van Con looked at him and screamed emotionally, If you don't wake up, I'll marry someone else. Hearing her say this, Mack Hai then quickly sat up, grabbed her shoulders, and said hurriedly, No way. You are my wife. Tong Van Con was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. You're awake? She burst into tears, threw herself into his arms, and sobbed. Hearing the doctor say that, I thought you would never wake up again. Her hand accidentally touched his wound, making Mack Hai then flinch, his face contorting. It hurts. Realizing what happened, Tong Van Con, with heartache, supported his injured arm. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Your arm is injured. Does it hurt a lot? Mack Hai then lowered his eyes to act spoiled towards her. Yes, it hurts a lot. The doctor said that for the next month, I have to be like this. The doctor standing nearby coughed dryly a few times, thinking to himself, I never said that. Tong Van Con's face turned bright red. She thought to herself in embarrassment, his arm is like that. Does that mean I have to bathe him? She imagined the scene of shirtless Mack Hai then, with his solid upper body muscles and a charming face, looking at his beloved wife. I haven't taken off my pants yet, and this part hasn't been bathed. Mack Hai then, sitting on the hospital bed, chuckled and tapped her forehead. What are you thinking about? Your face is so red. Tong Van Con excitedly blurted out, I don't want to help you take off your pants. After saying it, she immediately realized. Tong Van Con quickly covered her mouth. In her embarrassment, she just wanted to find a hole to crawl into. I'm so stupid. How could I speak my inner thoughts aloud? It's over, it's over. Mack Hai then will definitely think I'm an easy woman who spends all day thinking about those things. Mack Hai then was slightly stunned, looking at the thin nightgown on her body. He stood up and draped his suit jacket over her. Why are you wearing this? Come here, let's go home. She had run all the way here, and who knows how many people had seen her. He couldn't hide the jealousy in his heart. Mack Hai then looked at her seriously and said, Next time, you're not allowed to run outside in your pajamas. Seeing you in pajamas is my exclusive privilege. Tong Van Con turned her face away in embarrassment. Isn't this all? Because I was worried about you, so I rushed out here in a hurry? Mack Hai then smiled, put his arm around her shoulder, and said, Let's go. The doctor, seeing him about to leave, spoke up anxiously, Mr. Mack, your arm hasn't fully healed yet. You shouldn't go home yet. You still have to do a recheck tomorrow morning. Mack Hai then turned his head and glared at him coldly. How nosy. A while later, at the Mack family's house, Tong Van Con's face flushed. Why did he enter my room? Mack Hai then stood behind her and said with a smile, What should I do? With a cast on, there's no way I can take off my clothes. Quick, come help me, Van Con. Tong Van Con took a deep breath, turned around, and helped him undress. Raise your arm. It'll be done in a second. She helped him take off his shirt. The two of them stood inches apart, and their hearts began to beat erratically. Mack Hai then leaned down and gently held her in his arms. Seeing you so worried about me, I can't suppress my joy. I already wanted to do this back at the hospital. After saying that, he leaned down and pressed a kiss on her lips. Tong Van Con's face flushed red. A moment later, she reacted. In her embarrassment and agitation, she quickly pushed him away. Why are you being so sudden? I'm not prepared yet. She wasn't careful and bumped into the wound on Mack Hai then's arm. Mack Hai then clutched his arm and cried out, my arm. Tong Van Con was startled. She covered her mouth and looked at him guiltily. Tong Van Con lay on Mack Hai then's shoulder, sleeping soundly. Mack Hai then, who was fast asleep, was suddenly woken up by pain. My arm. Tong Van Con, who was resting her head on his injured arm, woke up groggily. Seeing that she was pressing against his injured arm, she quickly sat up with a look full of guilt. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Is your arm okay? Mac Hai then smiled and stroked her head to comfort her. It's okay, but today I'll have to ask Mrs. Mac to go to work with me. Tong Van Con looked at him blankly. Go to work? Right, he's also the CEO. His arm is injured like this. Eating and working will be inconvenient. I might as well take a day off from school to help him. Tong Van Con linked arms with Mac Hai, then as they walked into the Mac group. Two female employees looked at Tong Van Con in surprise and whispered, Isn't the person walking with President Mac that Miss Tong who was humiliated at the wedding? President Mac actually brought her to the company. She's still a student. Mac Hai then looked at Tong Van Con and said softly, You don't need to care about others' opinions. Tong Van Con lowered her head, biting her lip so hard it almost bled. How boring. Being so really isn't easy. Maintaining this posture for hours without getting tired. She sat on the sofa watching Mac Hai, then working seriously. There was nothing for her to do. If I had known, I wouldn't have come. I'm so sleepy. A while later, Mac Hai then walked over to the sofa and saw her curled up, sleeping soundly. A gentle smile played on the corner of his lips. Lazybones is asleep again. At that moment, Bon Vit opened the office door, looked at him, and said in a hurry, President Mac, it's time for the meeting. Mac Hai then raised his hand to interrupt him. Don't wake my wife. After saying that, he leaned down, gently caressed her cheek, and lifted her up. Phew, she's quite heavy. It seems I've fed her well. She needs to exercise more in the future. Carrying Tong Van Con into the resting room inside, Mac Hai then gently laid her down on the bed. Baby, I'll be gone for a while, and then I'll be back. When she sleeps, she looks especially pitiful. How lonely and scared must she be to hug herself to sleep like this? Mac Hai then stood up straight and looked seriously at Bon Vit standing at the door. Guard the door for me. Guard my wife well. Do not let anyone enter the resting room. Bon Vit raised his hand and replied seriously, Mission guaranteed to be accomplished. Mac Hai then coldly turned around and went out. Let's go. Bon Vit quickly replied yes. After he left, Tong Van Con lay on the bed, opened her eyes, and smiled happily. Looking at the cold and arrogant man approaching, Bon Vit gasped in fear. Isn't that President Lo? It's over. Why hasn't President Mac returned yet? I can't protect your little wife. President Lo walked up to Mac Hai-Than's office, looked at Bon Vit, and said coldly, The receptionist said Mac Hai, then is in a meeting. I'm going into his office to wait for him. Bon Vit gave a dry, fearful laugh, pointed to the resting room next door, and stammered, President Lo, President Mac will be back shortly. Would you like to wait in the meeting room next door? President Lo narrowed his eyes and coldly spat out two words, Open it. Bon Vit trembled with fear. Yes. The office door slammed shut. Bon Vit's face turned pale with fear as he cried out in his heart, Please don't let the CEO's wife wake up. President Lo probably won't go into the resting room. Buddha, Bodhisattva, Amen. In the resting room, Tong Van Con sat up and let out a sigh. She looked around the spacious room. Is this the CEO's resting room? Who is talking outside? She gently rubbed her eyes. It didn't sound like Mac Hai-Than's voice. Tong Van Con opened the resting room door and walked out. Looking at the strange man sitting in Mac Hai-Than's office, she was startled. Did I travel to another world after taking a nap? Isn't the person sitting there Mac Hai-Than? Are my eyes playing tricks on me, making me unable to see his face clearly? Or did Mac Hai-Than get plastic surgery? Seeing that Tong Van Con ignored him, President Lo narrowed his eyes in anger. To think you would ignore me. Not bad, woman. You have caught my attention. He kicked open the door to the resting room. Tong Van Con clutched her injured hip, burst into tears, and cried out, Ah, it hurts so much. President Lo stood in front of the resting room door, looked at her, and sneered. Where did you come from, little cat? What are you hiding in here for? Could you be a thief sneaking in here to steal business secrets or to steal President Mac? Tong Van Con bristled like a little cat and looked at him. I'm President Mac's new assistant, and I'm here to help clean up President Mac's resting room. I'm not a thief. Mac Hai then hadn't held the wedding with her yet, so she shouldn't announce it to the public. Who knows if the person in front of her is like those gossipy crowds? Bon Vit stood outside in fear, pressing his whole body against the door to eavesdrop. It sounds like they're arguing inside. Why isn't President Mac back yet? He didn't notice a tall, cold figure approaching. In the resting room, President Low crossed his arms and looked at her with a half smile. Is that so? Then, would the assistant mind brewing a cup of coffee for me? Oh, right, add plenty of sugar. Suddenly, a furious shout rang out. How bold! Mac Hai then stormed in angrily and yelled, Detestable Lotrach. How dare you order my wife to make coffee? Lautrec turned his head and smirked at him. Oh, speak of the devil, and he shall appear. Tong Van Con breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing him. Hi then, you're back. Makitan Angli Gudat Lochek. If you have nothing to do, get lost. Don't disturb my work. Seeing him easily subdue Lautrec like that, Tong Van Con's eyes lit up. Hythan is so handsome. Lautrec pouted aggrievedly and looked at Mac Hythan. The CEO still needs to work. How have I offended President Mac again? Mac Hythan let him go, then gently embraced Tong Van Con. Because you dared to order my wife around. Lautrec gasped, looking at the two in shock. This is your wife? He had originally planned to introduce his younger sister to Mac Hythan tonight. Now everything was ruined. At the hotel, the three of them sat around the dining table. Mac Hythan picked up his wine glass and said coldly, I need to think more about the contract. You have too many conditions. Lautrec roared angrily. This is already our company's lowest demand. Tong Van Con pushed herself up and softly interrupted them. You two take your time. I'll go to the restroom. After all, she didn't understand what the two grown men were talking about, and she didn't dare to ask. After she went out, Lautrec pulled out his phone and ordered the person on the other end. She's gone to the restroom. Act quickly and kidnap her to the outskirts by the beach. He raised his head smugly and looked at Mac Hythan. Will you sign the contract or not? If not, I'll sell your new wife off. The more Lautrec thought about it, the more smugly he smiled. Looking at his smile, Mac Hythan got goosebumps. He coughed twice and said in disgust, What are you laughing at? Goose. Meanwhile, Tong Van Con was washing her hands in the restroom. Suddenly, a large hand reached out, tightly covering her mouth and restraining her from behind. Tong Van Con turned pale with fear. MMPH, MMPH. She struggled frantically and angrily kicked him in the groin. Let me go. The kidnapper writhed in pain. In his anger, he drugged her with chloroform. Little brat, once you're unconscious, I'll settle the score with you. Tong Van Con's face turned pale, and her consciousness began to fade. Chloroform. Hi, then come save me quickly. The kidnapper quickly supported the unconscious Tong Van Con as they walked out. He smirked despicably at her beautiful face. Oh my, I told you not to drink so much, but you didn't listen to your brother at all. Tong Van Con knitted her brows and let out a faint groan. In the private room, Mac Hai then sat waiting. Seeing that Tong Van Con had been gone for so long without returning, his heart grew anxious. Van Con has been gone for so long. Why isn't she done yet? I'll go check. Wait here a moment. If you can't wait, you can leave first. Let's stop the contract discussion here. Looking at his hurried departure, Lautrec raised his wine glass and smiled sinisterly. Mac Hai then, you're too late. Your little wife is already in my hands. Mac Hai then stood in front of the ladies' restroom, banging frantically on the door. Several girls walked up, their cheeks flushed with anger, and looked at him. Just because you're handsome doesn't mean you can barge into the women's restroom at will. Who are you? This is the women's restroom. Mac Hai then ignored them. He kept banging frantically on the door, calling out Van Con. Tong Van Con, where are you? The unease in his heart welled up. Mac Hai then quickly pulled out his phone and made a call. Van Con, pick up the phone. Where on earth did you go? He ran to the reception desk and said anxiously, the security cameras. I want to see the footage. My wife is missing. The receptionist, seeing how anxious he was, quickly replied, Yes, sir. Please don't worry. I'm retrieving the surveillance footage now. Watching a strange man supporting the unconscious Tong Van Con out of the restroom, Mac Hai Van's expression changed. Damn it. Who is that man? Where'd he take Van Con? Just then his phone rang. Seeing that it was his wife calling, Mac Hai then answered it in a hurry. Van Con, where are you? Why were you suddenly taken away? Who is that man? On this side, Tong Van Con was tied up on a bed with tape covering her mouth, whimpering in fear. MMPH, MMPH, MMPH. The kidnapper held her phone and sneered. I am that man. Your wife is in my hands now. Someone paid me to kidnap your wife. As long as you do as I demand, I might consider letting her go. Tong Van Con cried out in her heart in terror. Hi then, save me. Mac Hai then returned to the dining room. He narrowed his eyes and glared angrily at the man inside. Lo Trake, if I agree to your conditions, will you release her? Lo Trake sat on the sofa, knitting his brows, and said displeasedly, President Mac, don't talk nonsense. Your tone makes it sound like you're treating me like a kidnapper. Mac Hai then glared at him in anger, gritting his teeth. I haven't said anything yet, but you already know someone was kidnapped? Lo Trake rested his hand on his knee and chuckled. I was just joking. He stood up and patted Mac Haidan's shoulder. President Mac is a smart man. I won't say any more unnecessary words. Mac Hai then sneered at him. VE2, Kiet, led a group of bodyguards inside to block Lo Trake. Lo Trake's face darkened in anger. What are you doing? Does Boss Mac want to detain me? VE2, Kiet held a laptop in his arms, looked at him, and said flatly, I don't know what you're talking about. President Mac said that if I show you this, you'll come with us quietly. Lo Trake knitted his brows and snatched the laptop. His face suddenly changed, turning pale as he saw the news on the screen. His hand trembled uncontrollably. Outside, a flock of birds flew by. On this side, Tong Van Con looked at the kidnapper in fear and alertness. Don't come over here. The kidnapper gave her a sinister smile. Beautiful. Do you mean you want me to take the initiative to pull you in? Why did you stop screaming? Or have you agreed? He leaned in close and whispered in her ear, Don't hope for President Mac to come play the hero to save the beauty anymore. Don't worry. Looking at her delicate and fragile appearance, his heart stirred. Follow me. I won't be any worse than Mac Haidan. Seeing no sign of resistance from Tong Van Con, he became even more smug. I didn't expect you to give up resisting so quickly. It seems Tong Van Con lost her footing and slipped. What do you want to do? Her eyes suddenly narrowed. Now, taking advantage of the kidnapper's lack of attention, Tong Van Con raised her leg and kicked him hard. Take a look at my self-defense Muay Thai. The kidnapper was hit in his private parts by Tong Van Con. His vision went black, and he collapsed unconscious. Suddenly, a loud shout rang out. Van Con. Tong Van Con trembled in fear and collapsed to the ground, all the strength draining from her body. She sat on the ground in a daze. Mac Hai then hurriedly pushed the door open, rushed in, and asked Tong Van Con anxiously, Van Con, are you okay? Tong Van Con stood up, with tears welling in her eyes from fear. She ran and threw herself into his arms. Hi then. Mac Hai then hugged her tightly, his heart aching. Tong Van Con threw herself into his chest and burst into loud wails. Hi then, I'm scared. Mac Haidan's heart clenched, distressed and angry. He directed all his resentment toward Lo Trake. Lo Trake, I will definitely make you feel my wrath. It's all because of him. Van Con, I promise this will never happen again. Looking at the unconscious kidnapper lying on the ground, Mac Hai then coldly ordered his subordinates behind him, don't worry about this person. Just find a place behind a mountain to bury him. Consider him fertilizer. The subordinate behind quickly replied, Yes, boss. Tong Van Con looked at him in fear and worry and asked, Hi then, we haven't found out who sent someone to kidnap me yet. Mac Hai then gently comforted her. It's no longer necessary. On another side, Lo Trake was locked in a small room by Mac Hai then. The cup of water on the table was knocked over and water spilled all over the floor. Mac Hai then walked in. He massaged his wrists, narrowed his eyes, and looked at him coldly. Young Master Lo, so you're not dead yet. You know, we can discuss business any way we like. Lo Trake was covered in wounds. He clutched his chest and groaned. Mac Hai then looked at him and continued coldly. As long as I'm satisfied, adding a few more zeros to the end is fine. But touching the woman of me, Mac Hai then, is a different story. Lo Trake looked at him in fear, anger, and resentment. Why, you don't go too far. Mac Hai then sat down, pinched his chin, and sneered. Don't worry, I won't kill you. However, I will just acquire your company, then split it into countless small companies, and finally sell them at a low price. I will make it so the Lo Group can never recover. Finally, when I looked at your company's books, I also discovered several loopholes and many things you wouldn't want others to know. I suggest you turn yourself in now. You might receive lenient treatment. After saying that, he opened the door and walked out. Lo Trake sat on the floor, wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth. His eyes flashed with malice. Mac Hai then, you really are a cold and ruthless person. You just wait. His resentful screams echoed throughout the room. Mac Hai then, I'm warning you. Lo Trake, will definitely make you pay. Mac Hai then ignored him and coldly left. Arriving back at the Mac family home, Mac Hai then carried Tong Van Con inside. He carefully sat her down on a chair and said gently, "Come on, sit down and rest for a bit. Don't be afraid, everything is fine now." Tong Van Con tightly clutched his hand in fear. "Hi then, can you stay here? Don't leave me." Mac Hai then's heart ached. He gently kissed her forehead. "The Mac family is hosting a banquet today. How about I take you there to relax a bit? It's also a good opportunity for you to meet my family." Tong Van Con looked at him hesitantly, but Mac Hai then smiled and teased her. "An ugly wife still has to meet the in-laws, right? Besides, my wife is not ugly." Tong Van Con smiled and nodded in response. "Okay." In the banquet hall, Grandfather Mac looked at the beautiful and lively girl beside him, smiling dotingly. "You've been in America for quite some time. How could you bear to come back?" The beautiful girl beside him stuck out her tongue, hugged his arm, and acted spoiled. "You're asking questions that put people on the spot again." Seeing Tong Van Con and Mac Hai then walking in together, Grandfather Mac smiled and waved to them. "Hi then." The beautiful young girl beside Grandfather Mac turned her head in surprise. Mac Hai then stared intently. Upon seeing that beautiful girl, Mac Hai then's entire body froze. "Why is it her?" He quickly looked at Tong Van Con, gave a forced smile, and said, "Van Con, greet grandfather." Tong Van Con smiled and greeted Grandfather Mac. "Hello, grandfather." Mac then Angeep, the head of the Mac family, nodded in satisfaction looking at the two of them. Little Van Con and Hai then are indeed a well-matched couple. The young girl next to Grandfather Mac crossed her arms and sneered, looking at Tong Van Con. "So she is Hai then's fiancée. Oh right, I suddenly remembered something important." Seeing the hostility in her eyes, Tong Van Con sadly lowered her eyes. What does she want to do? Lam Keo took off her earring and placed it in Tong Van Con's palm. This was the heirloom of the Mac family back then. Back then, Hai then and I had an engagement, and he gave this heirloom to me, saying that only his fiancée is qualified to wear it. She ignored Mac Hai then's darkened face and continued to say with a bright smile, "Today, these ruby earrings should be returned to their original owner." Tong Van Con frowned, a flash of loneliness in her eyes. So this Lam Keo turned out to be Mac Hai then's ex-lover. What should she do now? Lam Keo sneered, looking at her and asking, "Mrs. Mac, don't you want to accept them?" Seeing the tense atmosphere, Grandfather Mac quickly stepped in to mediate. It was all my fault back then. If I hadn't misunderstood that you and Hai then had feelings for each other, I wouldn't have forced Hai then to give the earrings to you." Keo, you don't blame me, do you?" Lam Keo smiled and quickly replied, "How could I, Grandfather Mac?" Grandfather Mac looked at Tong Van Con, smiling happily, holding her hand tightly, and saying in a low voice, "Van Con, you must keep them carefully." Tong Van Con smiled, nodded, and replied, "Yes." After saying that, Grandfather Mac turned around and walked into the party. "I still have some work to do, so I won't chat with you young people anymore." After Grandfather Mac left, Mac Hai then also followed. "Van Con, let's go." Lam Keo looked at him with a half-smile and asked, "What's wrong? Now that Grandfather is gone, do you want to leave too?" Mac Hai then gave her a cold look. "I have some matters to handle. I won't accompany you anymore." Lam Keo ran up and intimately hugged his arm. "Wait a minute about that matter." Mac Hai then looked at her with displeasure. "What do you want to do?" Tong Van Con covered her mouth in surprise, looking at the two of them. The two of them. Mac Hai then turned his head to look at her and said softly, "Van Con, wait for me here. I'll go over there for a moment." Tong Van Con blankly replied, "Yes." After saying that, Mac Hai then roughly pulled Lam Keo to the side. "Come here with me. Let's go outside and talk." Before leaving, Lam Keo did not forget to turn back and look at Tong Van Con with a provocative smile. Standing inside, Tong Van Con silently watched Mac Hai then and Lam Keo talking privately outside. Tong Van Con covered her mouth in disbelief. With tears in her eyes, she couldn't control herself anymore and turned away. Lifting her dress, Tong Van Con ran outside through the crowd of guests. She found a quiet corner, sat down, and burst into tears. "Why do I care so much when seeing Lam Keo and him together?" Tong Van Con raised her hand to wipe her tears, but the more she wiped, the more they fell. Suddenly, a handkerchief was handed to her. Tong Van Con looked up in surprise. You are Lam Jing?" Lam Keo's older brother handed her the handkerchief and asked coldly, "I'm Lam Trin. Are you okay?" Tong Van Con forced a smile, waved her hand, and replied, "Thank you for your concern. No need. Excuse me, I must go back now." Lam Trin smiled with interest, looking at her. "So she is Mac Hai, Dan's wife? How interesting." Tong Van Con returned to the party downcast. As she walked, she reminded herself, forget it, my marriage with Mac Hai then was not out of love anyway. He has what he needs from me, and I shouldn't be sad. She walked with her head down, and without paying attention, she bumped into a firm chest. Tong Van Con held her forehead and cried out softly, ah, it hurts. Mac Hai then smiled gently and rubbed her head. Silly girl, don't walk with your head down. Are you okay? Tong Van Con looked at him in surprise. Hi then, aren't you with? Mac Hai then laughed and replied, are you talking about Lam Kyo? She called me over to discuss business. It's not what you think. You made me worry about you for so long. You should be punished. He lovingly held her face. In the Mac family mansion, next is the self-service lunch. We have prepared various dishes for everyone. Please feel free to choose, distinguished guests. Tong Van Con lowered her face anxiously. Mac Hai then stood beside her, smiled and asked, are you embarrassed, wife? He put his hand on her shoulder, pulled her into his embrace, and said gently, I think we should find some time to have our wedding ceremony. Tong Van Con's cheeks flushed red as she looked at him in shock. Too close. Mac Hai then gently caressed her cheek and asked softly, Man, do you accept my proposal? Tong Van Con's heart couldn't help but beat rapidly. You are too close. Looking at him with a face full of anticipation, she kept telling herself in her heart, I agree. Mac Hai then poked her flushed face. Man, you like to blush so much. I won't have the heart to make a move when the time comes. Tong Van Con glared at him angrily. Am I your toy? Mac Hai then dotingly pinched her cheek. Tong Van Con looked at him petulantly. You always pinch it. In the wedding dress shop, a beautiful and gorgeous wedding dress was displayed in the glass cabinet. 2 female staff in the shop helped Tong Van Con try on the wedding dress. Several female staff nearby looked at her and whispered, I heard that Mac Hai then has changed 3 designers just to choose the most satisfying wedding attire. Sigh, rich people are indeed different. In an ancient Italian city, Mac Hai then, dressed in a white suit, held Tong Van Con's hand and danced in the middle of the wedding reception. I will give you an unforgettable wedding for a lifetime. Only the most luxurious wedding is worthy of you. He smiled gently and kissed her hand. The wedding celebration plan of Come On Studio. The guests at the party looked admiringly at the handsome man and beautiful woman dancing on the stage. Oh, being together is so happy. This is where my parents once held their wedding. I hope the place where we hold our wedding will be the most meaningful memory in this lifetime. 2 little girls walked in front, scattering flowers, and Tong Van Con, wearing a beautiful wedding dress, walked into the aisle. At this moment, do you two voluntarily become husband and wife and promise to never part whether in poverty or sickness in the future until you grow old together? Tong Van Con and Mac Hai then looked straight into each other's eyes and smiled happily. I do. Mac Hai then held Tong Van Con's hand and put a ring on her ring finger. I vow to keep one heart and grow old without parting. This episode ends here. If you like it, please give me a like and a share to give me more motivation to make more videos. Remember to click follow to watch the next episodes. Wish you all a day full of energy.